The Dark Scrolls. No one ever asked the girl if she understood what it meant to be a bride. No one wondered if her narrow hips could survive the brutal miracle of childbirth. In that cold hall of polished stone, beneath flickering torches and the solemn faces of noble witnesses, Margaret Beaufort became a woman in the eyes of the law, though she was scarcely more than a child of 12. It was 1455, and England was a kingdom splintered by ambition. The Wars of the Roses had turned family against family, Lancaster against York, ambition against survival. Margaret was a Lancastrian heiress, her bloodline a key that unlocked power, land, and the possibility of a throne. The men who orchestrated her marriage saw her not as a girl but as an instrument, a necessary sacrifice, a piece in a larger game. Her husband, Edmund Tudor, was over 20 years old, a man of careful courtesy in public and steely determination in private. He knew precisely what marrying Margaret would mean, a claim through her royal blood that could fortify the Tudor line. To him, she was the guarantee of legitimacy and leverage. To her, he was a stranger she was commanded to honor, a presence she could neither refuse nor escape. In the months that followed, Margaret learned quickly that her life was no longer her own. The court whispered of her fragile beauty and her unusual gravity, how she seldom laughed, how she moved like a girl who had already seen too much. When the first signs of pregnancy came, Margaret's attendants said little, only bowed their heads and prayed. No one dared admit aloud the horror that hung over them all. A 13-year-old girl would be forced to carry a child whose birth might kill her. At night, she would lie awake, staring into the darkness, wondering if God had chosen her for this trial, or if she was being punished for sins she could not name. Sometimes she pressed a hand to her belly, feeling a tiny flutter that terrified her more than any specter in her dreams. She was not ready. She could not be ready. Yet time would not slow for her fear. By the time her body grew heavy with the child, Edmund Tudor had been captured by Yorkist forces. The Wars of the Roses had reached into their household with cold fingers, leaving her alone and vulnerable. She was only 13 when he died of plague in captivity, an irony so sharp she thought it might carve her open. She was a widow and an expectant mother in the same breath. In that moment, any last trace of childhood vanished. The midwives who attended her delivery understood that they might be presiding over a birth and a funeral in one. Margaret's frame was so slight they doubted she could survive. The pains came in waves so fierce she thought her bones were breaking. She screamed and wept, but there was no comfort, no reprieve, only the inexorable truth that she must endure or perish. After hours of agony, her son emerged into the world, small, silent, blue-lipped. For a moment she believed she had endured all that torment for nothing. Then a tiny gasp, a tremor of life. They named him Henry. Later, many would call him Henry Tudor, the boy who would grow into a king. But in that moment, he was simply a frail scrap of flesh clutched to Margaret's chest as she drifted into a fevered delirium. She survived, though the ordeal left scars no physician could heal. Some said she was never again able to bear another child. Some whispered it was her punishment for daring to claim a place in the great game of thrones. But Margaret did not think in such terms. In her exhausted heart, she felt only that she had been tested, that God had given her back her life for a purpose she could not yet comprehend. In the weeks after Henry's birth, she lay in a high chamber, staring through the leaded glass at the winter sky. Snow drifted against the windowsills like ghosts. Visitors came and went, cousins, clerics, stewards. But all she could think of was the tiny body sleeping in a cradle beside her bed. She had carried him, nearly died for him, and now he was the sum of all her hopes. Whatever else the world demanded of her, she would never let him be torn away. But England was not a place that respected a mother's vows. Henry was the only living link between two rival claims, the Tudor claim and the royal Plantagenet line. That made him both precious and dangerous. Margaret, though barely 14, recognized that her child was already a pawn, a symbol, a prize. And she knew that if she failed to protect him, he would vanish into some dungeon or battlefield, and her sacrifice would be for nothing. It was in those long, sleepless nights that she made her silent promise. She would do whatever it took. She would endure humiliation, intrigue, loneliness. She would give herself over to the ruthless machinery of power. If she could not be free, then she would be formidable. And one day she would see her son raised up above all who had ever doubted her. For now, though, she was a young widow, her belly hollow, her heart bruised, her face still soft with the roundness of girlhood. She was supposed to be meek and grateful that she had survived. But behind her lowered lashes, something had begun to harden, a resolve that would never be broken. Margaret's guardians soon arranged her next marriage. It was unthinkable for a noble heiress to remain unwed, especially one whose inheritance could buy loyalty in a kingdom always on the brink of civil war. Before the snow melted, she was pledged to Sir Henry Stafford, a man nearly twice her age, a knight with enough wealth to protect her but no ambition to claim her son as his own. For that small mercy she was quietly thankful. She brought her infant with her to Stafford's estate, a grey fortress perched above the Severn River. There, Margaret learned to mask her bitterness behind a composed expression, to speak in measured phrases that revealed nothing. She would not waste her tears on an audience that could not understand them. Instead, she studied. She listened. She practiced the delicate art of appearing harmless. It was not that she had abandoned hope of happiness. It was simply that she understood happiness was a luxury she could no longer afford. Each day that her son remained safe was a day she had won. Each gesture of deference she received was a reminder that power could be gathered in quiet ways. As England's noble houses tore themselves apart in battle after battle, Margaret waited. She observed alliances forming and fracturing. She read every letter that passed through Stafford's hall, hungry for any scrap of news that might affect her son's fate. The men in her world believed that strategy was their domain alone. Margaret let them believe it. All the while, she was weaving her own invisible web. She was not yet England's most powerful woman. To most, she was only a girl who had been married off, widowed, and married again, a vessel for other people's ambitions. But she knew the truth, and it flickered in her mind each time she laid eyes on Henry's sleeping face. She had survived the worst the world could do to her. She was still here, and one day, when the moment came, she would be ready. Years unspooled like thread from a loom, each season blending into the next. Margaret watched as England tore itself apart, and though her own world often seemed quiet, just the low hush of servants and the measured footsteps of her husband, she never forgot that she was living in the eye of a storm. Henry was growing. His hair turned the soft brown of a sparrow's wing, his eyes solemn and wide. Some days, when he looked at her, she felt as if he already understood how precarious their existence was. He never cried much. Even as an infant, he seemed to sense that too much noise could draw the wrong kind of attention. When he was not yet 4, rumors began to creep through the country that York's fortunes were rising. Edward of York was gathering strength, taking territory, winning loyalty by promise or by fear. Each battle that crowned him with victory was another nail driven into the coffin of the Lancastrian cause. Margaret knew what that meant. Her son's lineage could become a liability so dangerous it would justify his elimination. At night she lay awake again, feeling that same cold dread she had known in childbirth. There was no midwife to guide her through this labor. She would have to decide for herself how to keep Henry safe. She prayed for guidance, but she knew that in the end, prayer alone would not be enough. In 1461, Edward of York was proclaimed King Edward IV. The House of Lancaster fell into confusion, and Henry VI, Margaret's kinsman, was forced to flee. The Lancastrian lords scattered, many seeking sanctuary in foreign courts or hiding among their last loyal allies. Margaret watched the tides change with the composure she had taught herself to wear, but inside she was making plans. Stafford, her second husband, did not share her urgency. He was a cautious man, loyal to whichever side seemed likeliest to triumph, more interested in preserving his lands than risking everything for lost causes. He cared for Margaret in his quiet way, respected her piety, her intelligence, but he would not jeopardize his own estate for the child of another man. She could hardly blame him. She knew the cost better than anyone. But love was not what she needed. She needed strategy, leverage, the promise of protection stronger than any affection. It was then she made the first decision that would change the course of English history. She arranged for Henry to be placed in the care of Jasper Tudor, her late husband's brother and one of the few men she trusted. Jasper was exiled, hunted, always in motion, but he was resolute in his loyalty to their family. Margaret believed that if any man could keep her son alive through the ruin of Lancaster, it was Jasper. Letting Henry go nearly broke her. She kissed his smooth cheek, pressed her forehead to his small shoulder, and whispered that he must remember who he was. He would not understand until he was grown, but she said it anyway. You were born for something greater. When Jasper spirited the boy away, she went back into the house and sat alone in her chamber. She folded her hands in her lap, willing herself not to weep. Outside, the wind howled through the crenellations. Margaret stared at the hearth and promised herself she would not falter. In the years that followed, she became a master of endurance. She learned to navigate the delicate dance of allegiance, to offer just enough loyalty to Edward IV that she and her husband would not be considered enemies. She gave no one cause to question her devotion to the new king. She signed letters with courteous phrases. She attended court when summoned, smiled when appropriate, and bent her head in deference. But all the while, she was listening, watching, waiting. When Henry Stafford died, some said of wounds sustained in battle, others whispered it was fever. Margaret found herself widowed a second time before her 30th birthday. She grieved sincerely, for he had been kind to her in his own cautious way. Yet, even in her sorrow, she understood that widowhood brought her a peculiar freedom. She could choose her next alliance more carefully, with her son's prospects always at the forefront of her mind. It was in this window of opportunity that she arranged her third marriage, this time to Thomas Stanley, a man whose influence was nearly unmatched in the north of England. Stanley was no stranger to the shifting tides of fortune. He had built his wealth and power by studying which way the wind was blowing and trimming his sails accordingly. Margaret knew that to some this match seemed a mere convenience, a practical union of two powerful houses. But to her it was something far more vital: insurance. Stanley's vast network of alliances, his formidable retinue, his reputation for prudent calculation, all these things could be the shield her son would need when the time came to stake his claim. And Margaret never stopped believing that the time would come. She saw it in her dreams, the boy she had nearly died to bring into the world, standing crowned and unassailable. Her marriage to Stanley was nothing like her first. He did not treat her as a child or a prize, nor did he offer her the warmth of a lover. He was a partner in name, an associate, someone who could be persuaded by reason and ambition. In some ways, this suited her perfectly. Love had always been dangerous, distracting. What she needed now was clarity. While she maintained her outward piety, she was famous for her devotion to prayer and good works. Margaret was quietly weaving connections to those disillusioned with Yorkist rule. Every letter she sent, every visit she made to sympathetic cousins and old Lancastrian loyalists became another thread in the web she was spinning. She wrote often to Jasper, who by then was living in exile with young Henry. Each message was coded in the cautious language of family affection, but the meaning was unmistakable. She was watching, preparing, believing. She urged her son never to forget his claim, never to doubt his destiny. England was never stable for long. In 1470, the wheel turned again. Henry VI was briefly restored to the throne by his old ally Warwick, and for a moment it seemed the Lancastrians might prevail. Margaret's heart leapt at the thought that her son could come home safely at last. But within the year, Edward IV had reclaimed power, and Henry VI was dead, likely murdered in the Tower. The news shook her to her bones, not only because a king had been struck down in secret, but because it was a reminder that no one was beyond the reach of ambition's cruelty. If she was ever to secure her son's future, she would have to be as ruthless as those who had crushed her kin. So she redoubled her efforts. She visited shrines and offered donations, her piety a shield against suspicion. She arranged advantageous matches for distant relatives to secure their loyalty. She listened to every rumor, no matter how trivial. She learned to look into a man's eyes and see whether he was too weak to keep a secret or too vain to resist a promise. In public, Margaret was still the dutiful wife and noblewoman, tall, composed, clothed in the quiet dignity of her faith. In private, she was something far fiercer, a strategist, a mother, a survivor. Her will had been forged in the furnace of her childhood ordeal, and no one who truly knew her doubted that she would spend the rest of her life ensuring that her suffering had not been in vain. All the while, Henry was growing into a man across the sea in Brittany, far from the wars that had decimated his homeland. He was learning courtly manners and the arts of diplomacy, his existence an unspoken threat to Edward IV's sons, who were themselves born into the treacherous inheritance of the Plantagenet dynasty. And so Margaret waited, never allowing herself to hope too easily or despair too deeply. She knew that the future would belong not to those who were strongest, but to those who were patient enough to endure, cunning enough to seize the moment when it came. In the hush of her private chapel, she prayed for her son's safety, for her own strength, for the courage to do what must be done when the hour arrived. For in her heart, Margaret Beaufort knew one unassailable truth. Destiny was not a gift, it was a conquest. Spring came late in the year 1483, bringing with it a storm that would sweep across the kingdom. Edward IV, the Yorkist king who had restored his dynasty twice over, died suddenly at 40. For a moment, the entire realm seemed to hold its breath, teetering on the edge of uncertainty. Edward's heir, the young Edward V, was only 12, a boy too untested to rule a kingdom soaked in rivalries and vendettas. In that fragile interlude, Margaret saw a fracture she had long anticipated. The Yorkist house, so proud and unassailable, was now divided between those who would protect the child king and those who would usurp him. It did not take long for Richard, Duke of Gloucester, to show his intentions. He had himself declared protector, and the young Edward was escorted to the Tower of London for his own safety. Within weeks, Edward and his younger brother vanished behind those cold stone walls. The rumors began almost immediately. Rumors of murder whispered in corridors and marketplaces. The boys were never seen again. Margaret heard the stories with a strange, unshakable calm. She had always known that a throne was never claimed without blood. If Richard of Gloucester was capable of disposing of his own nephews, there would be little to stop him from hunting down every other potential rival, including her son. But Richard's ruthless ascension also presented the chance she had waited for. The country was horrified, disgusted, uncertain. Old loyalties were unraveling. Many who had once sworn allegiance to the Yorks began to ask themselves whether this new king had overstepped the bounds of decency. In that dawning outrage, Margaret saw the outline of her opportunity. She began to move in earnest. Under the pretext of courtly obligation, she traveled south and established lines of communication with key nobles, among them Lord Thomas Stanley, her own husband whose influence was critical, and Elizabeth Woodville, the widowed queen whose sons had disappeared. They were an unlikely alliance, a mother bereft of her children and a mother whose child was far away, each with reasons to despise Richard. Margaret knew she could not allow sentiment to soften her resolve. Every kindness she extended was measured, every promise she made weighed against her son's future. She laid out her vision to Elizabeth Woodville with the serene conviction of someone who had spent her life preparing for this moment. Her proposal was bold, that Henry Tudor should wed Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of Edward IV. Such a marriage would unite the rival claims, Lancaster and York, and present England with an alternative to Richard's rule, a reconciliation that could quiet decades of civil war. To Elizabeth, whose own children were likely dead, it was an offer that combined vengeance with salvation. But no scheme of such magnitude could remain hidden forever. Richard soon learned of Margaret's plotting and ordered her arrest. She was placed under her husband's custody, confined to his estates, a gesture that was as much a warning as a punishment. Many men would have abandoned their cause in the face of such danger. Margaret did not flinch. From within her confinement, she continued to orchestrate the conspiracy. Stanley, shrewd as ever, maintained his plausible loyalty to Richard even as he allowed his wife's messages to flow to her allies. Every scrap of information she could glean, every movement of troops, every whisper of dissent was relayed across the Channel to Brittany, where Henry Tudor was waiting. The months that followed were a test of her endurance, unlike any she had faced. She was separated from her son by hundreds of miles of sea, watched by the king's agents, and dependent on the unreliable loyalty of men whose courage often failed them at the last moment. Yet she did not waver. She rose before dawn to pray, to plan, to write letters that might shape the destiny of England itself. Then, in the summer of 1485, came the moment she had envisioned so many times in the silent hours of her solitude. Henry Tudor landed on the Welsh coast with an army behind him. His banners bore the red dragon of Cadwallader, a symbol of old Welsh kingship, and the hope of every Lancastrian exile who had ever believed in the cause. Margaret's household held its breath. If Henry failed, he would die, and so would any chance she had to see her life's purpose fulfilled. She spent those days in ceaseless prayer, her fingers working the beads of her rosary until they were polished smooth. She refused to imagine defeat. She refused to believe that God had spared her again and again, only to let everything slip away. On the 22nd of August, 1485, at Bosworth Field, the last battle of the Wars of the Roses was fought. Richard III charged into the fray himself, his crown fastened to his helmet, determined to crush this upstart claimant once and for all. But in the final hour, it was Thomas Stanley, Margaret's husband, who turned the tide. His forces, arrayed on the sidelines, had watched as the two armies clashed. Then, at the critical moment, Stanley's men surged forward to join Henry. Some said later that Margaret's influence had determined Stanley's choice. Others claimed he was merely waiting to see which side would prevail. The truth was more complicated. It was the culmination of decades of alliances, fears, and promises, all woven into a single irrevocable act. Richard was cut down in the chaos. His broken body was stripped and carried away. And there, in the aftermath, Henry Tudor was crowned King Henry VII with a circlet plucked from the fallen king's head. When news of the victory reached Margaret, she is said to have wept for the first time in many years. Not for sorrow, but for relief so profound it left her trembling. She had outlasted them all, kings, queens, rivals, and monsters. The child she had nearly died to bring into the world was now the sovereign of England. Her life changed overnight. She was granted the unprecedented title of My Lady the King's Mother, a rank that placed her above every woman in the realm except the queen herself. She maintained her own household, her own income, her own authority. Courtiers soon learned that nothing of importance reached the king's ears without passing first through Margaret Beaufort's council. And yet she never forgot the girl she had been, the child who had wept in secret, the young mother who had clutched her newborn in terror and awe. Those memories became the silent foundation of her power. She governed her household with strict piety, rising before dawn to attend Mass, wearing the simplest gowns even as her influence grew legendary. Some mistook her composure for coldness. Some whispered that she had become more cleric than woman, that she loved nothing on earth but her own ambition. But those who truly knew her understood. Everything she had done for her son. The sacrifices, the compromises, the peril, all of it was the price of securing his destiny. When Henry married Elizabeth of York, uniting the feuding houses and founding the Tudor dynasty, Margaret sat in the abbey with her hands folded neatly in her lap. She did not smile. She did not weep. But in her eyes was the quiet triumph of someone who had waited decades for the world to recognize what she had always believed, that she was not merely a pawn in other men's games. She was the architect of victory. In the years that followed, she remained a formidable presence in Henry's court. She advised him on matters of policy and succession. She oversaw the upbringing of her grandchildren, including the boy who would one day become Henry VIII. She endowed colleges and promoted learning, determined that the kingdom her son had won would be strengthened by scholarship as well as blood. Margaret Beaufort died in June 1509, just 2 months after her son. By then she had lived to see the Tudor line secure and her grandson crowned. At her funeral, the greatest lords and ladies of England bowed their heads in respect, not merely to her title, but to the indomitable will that had shaped a dynasty. History would remember her as the mother of a king. But in truth, she had been something rarer, a woman who turned her suffering into strength, who transformed a childhood tragedy into a legacy that outlasted the men who thought her weak. And so her story endures, not just as a tale of ambition, but as a testament to the power of a single, unbreakable promise, that no child, however fragile, is born without purpose, and no woman, however overlooked, is powerless to change the course of history. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.